Hi class, it's Dr. Lindner. Welcome. And what we're going to be talking about in this um, series is going to be muscle function, muscle physiology. So let's take a look and understand what muscle is and what some of the functions are. So when we talk about some of the functions and we just think about the muscular system in general, um, we can say, well, we know that when muscles contract, they create movement, right? We know that you could say, okay, arm, lift up this glass, I want to drink water. So when muscles contract, they can create movement. They can locomote, right? They can help you walk, they can help you run. So movement. Stabilizing body positions. When muscles contract, they can help stabilize different body parts or your body in its entirety. You can stand still and all your postural muscles are contracting. Some of them are contracting isometrically, meaning there's no change in the joint angle. You have rotator cuff muscles around the shoulder that are contracting to help stabilize the shoulder, and you don't even know what's happening. Muscles are involved in storing and mobilizing substances within the body. So muscles can store sugar. So this is, let's bring this down here. This is glucose. And what glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a 6-carbon sugar. And we have something called glycolysis, where if this is the cell and the nucleus, and we have mitochondria, remember those, which is where ATP is generated, glucose is broken down by a process called glycolysis. And what that is, lysis means to split. So glycolysis or glycolysis, lysis means to split. We're splitting down glucose. So here's glucose. If we split it, what we end up with are 2 3-carbon sugars, right? Because we broke this bond here. We split it right down the center. So this is glucose, and this is pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Now, in the presence of oxygen, now this process here, glycolysis, takes place in the cytoplasm. But when it breaks it down into when glycolysis breaks down glucose into these 2 pyruvates, these 2 pyruvates can now enter the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. You have to have oxygen that's present. Otherwise, pyruvate gets converted to lactic acid, which is another lactic acid. It's another type of sugar. All right, but in the presence of oxygen, pyruvate goes into the mitochondria so we can produce ATP. All right, so why do I bring this up? Because when glucose is in high concentrations, glucose is stored as glycogen. Anything that ends in ogen means it's inactive. So you have inactive glucose called glycogen, and it's stored in 2 places, the liver and the muscles, primarily. So the muscles is one place that stores glucose, and it can mobilize it when needed. Okay, and when muscles contract, they generate heat. We know that when you exercise and muscles are moving, they generate heat and you perspire to cool yourself off. Okay, most of the energy that's created in the mitochondria by the Krebs cycle, most of that energy is dispersed into heat. Most of the energy is dispersed to heat, and the leftover is used to make ATP. Okay. Now, some of the properties of muscle is electrical excitability, which means muscles can be irritated. All right. Contractility means that they can shorten. Muscles have the ability of shortening, which is when the origin of a muscle and the insertion of a muscle move closer together. So the origin and the insertion are the two attachment sites of muscle to bone. So if this was, let's say, the elbow joint, and here's the biceps that crosses the elbow joint. Up here, more proximally, that would be the origin, and over here, this would be the insertion, and the hand would be here with the fingers, okay? So when origin and insertion move closer together, and this angle gets smaller, okay, like that, well, that's contractility, and extensibility is the ability of it to open up again, to extend. Okay, and elasticity is the muscle's ability to elongate a little bit beyond its anatomical position or its anatomical resting point. Now, when it loses its elasticity and goes beyond that, that's when things tear. But everything has a degree of joint play due to the elasticity. Now, when we look at different types of contractions, we're going to focus on concentric contraction, eccentric contraction, and isometric contraction. Now, concentric and eccentric. If this is the starting point, number one, and you're lifting the book up here to point 2, concentric is when your biceps contracted. Remember, the origin is up here and the insertion is here. In the starting position, it was like that. It was longer because the hand was here. So when the origin and insertion approximated each other and moved closer together, that's concentric. We also call that the positive or the acceleratory phase. It's the positive contraction or the acceleration phase. It's when you're able to generate enough force in the muscle to overcome the resistance of the load or the weight with gravity that's working down against it. Now, eccentric is, again, we're looking at the biceps, again, which is going from here to here. So here's the origin, and here's the insertion on the radius. And this was the starting point at the top, and you're lowering it to bring it down. What's happening to the biceps? It's elongating. Right here, it's shortened, bringing it up. Here, it's elongating. Remember, gravity is working down, so you have to be strong enough to carry that load at a pace in which gravity wants to force it down. You're not letting gravity just take it down, you're lowering it slower against the force of gravity. That's eccentric. We call this the negative contraction or the deceleration because you're slowly lowering it. You have to be in control of it. And the way you can remember it is that the E in eccentric, you can think the E is for elongation. Now, isometric, there's no contraction. You have the muscles in the front, the anterior muscles, and the muscles in the back, the posterior muscles, contracting simultaneously, and there's no change in the joint angle, so there's no movement at all. So when we look at these, by definition, again, you have concentric is when the muscle tension that's generated is enough to exceed the resistance. That's the weight. And then what happens is the muscle shortens, meaning the origin and the insertion approximate each other. We call that the positive contraction and the acceleration phase. Eccentric with the E is when peak tension is less than the load and the muscle elongates. This is when the origin and insertion move further apart from one another, and that's called the negative contraction or the deceleratory phase. Isometric is when the tension never exceeds the resistance, so there's no change in the joint angle at all. That would be like pushing against a parked car. Okay, there's no change. You heard me use these two words, origin and insertion. Origin and insertion are both attachment sites of muscle to bone. How does muscle attach to bone? Muscle attaches to bone by way of tendons. And there's a more proximal attachment of them, and there's a more distal attachment. In the case of the biceps, here's the elbow joint. The origin was up here, and the insertion was here. So the origin is more proximal, the insertion is more distal. And usually it's the insertion that's usually the part that moves, whereas the origin is the part that's staying still. Okay. Now, let's look at these words, agonist, antagonist, and synergist. Well, an agonist, if we looked at the elbow, the biceps brachii would be an agonist, right? It's a main mover that provides elbow flexion. A synergist is a muscle that can assist that. So any other elbow flexor, maybe the brachialis or the brachioradialis, those are synergistic. Antagonistic is one that's going to oppose it. In the word oppose is opposite. So it has to be on the opposite side of the bone. Agonists and antagonists are opposite to one another. So if agonist is the bicep and it's anterior, the antagonist that opposes it has to be posterior. So in this case would be the triceps. And when you hear the word innervation, in the word innervation, we see nerve. How do muscles contract? Well, muscles have nerve supply. It's the nerve supply to the muscle. Now, muscles of the upper extremity, everything from the shoulder down to the fingers, they come from a group of nerves that emanate out of the neck called the brachial plexus. And that's from the levels of C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1, nerve roots. And the muscles of the lower extremity, from the glutes all the way down, we have two plexi. We have a lumbar plexus, which goes from L1 to L4 nerve roots. And there's a sacral plexus, which goes from L4 to S4 nerve roots. If it wasn't for those nerves, the muscles would be paralyzed. If you cut a nerve, the muscle's paralyzed. If there's pressure or a pinched nerve or a subluxation to a nerve, there could still be supply getting to the muscle, but maybe not at 100%. So if it's at half of that, then the muscle's only working at half the strength. The muscle can weaken, and over time, we say that it can atrophy. Atrophy means it's shrinking. It's getting much smaller in size. The opposite of atrophy is hypertrophy, like hypertrophy. So these are opposites. Hypertrophy is what happens when you go to the gym and you exercise and muscles get bigger. Okay, good place for our first break. And when we come back, we'll get into some of the histology of muscle.